Hello, everybody, and welcome back to Love Meets Literature. Very excited for this episode. Joe put it together himself. But before we begin, I am your host, Rachel, and you can find me on Instagram at Paperbacks and Sketchbooks.
And I'm your other host, Joe, and you can find us at Love Meets Literature.
Please do give us a follow. You can find us nearly everywhere. It will help us immensely. So how's it going?
Good. I have been making my way through ACOTAR, and I realized that my library loan for The Sea of Monsters is coming to an end, so I need to switch gears and hurry up and finish that.
That you do. Those library loans, they will sneak up on you.
Yeah, and then all of a sudden it's just gone, and then someone else has it, and you're like, I was only halfway through.
That's how I'm feeling right now with my current read, because it's a physical library book, but it is a new book, so I can't renew it, and it's due in 2 days.
Yeah, gonna have to pull like the all-nighter to read it.
I know, which it's really good, so I'm not mad about having to do that, but that just means I won't have time for anything else.
Yeah, that's true.
So you've been reading ACOTAR and Sea of Monsters. How are both of those going?
Sea of Monsters, I remember not liking it as much when I read it the first time when I was younger. And this time around, I am enjoying it a lot more. I think a lot more of the concepts that I just didn't understand. Now I grasp them much better, obviously, because I'm an adult.
Well, have you noticed too, like now that you are older, how much humor Rick Riordan puts into his books?
Yes, it's like they're sneaking in little jokes everywhere.
Yes.
And it's super entertaining, and I love it.
It's so funny. I didn't remember Percy being as hilarious as he is when I was younger. All the jokes kind of flew over my head.
Yeah, the writing is like way more witty and sarcastic when you're older and you can like actually understand the context.
Yeah.
As far as ACOTAR goes, it's definitely getting really interesting, which is probably why I've faltered on my Sea of Monsters, and so my library loan has snuck up on me. So I'm very excited to continue reading that one as well. And I think I'm finally at that point in ACOTAR where everyone starts to get really hooked on it, because there's much more like drama happening now and some action has actually happened. So
what part are you at?
So spoilers for anyone that hasn't read the first, first 100, 200 pages. I think I'm about that far. I can't remember. But Feyre has just figured out that Tamlin is a high Fey Lord. Then there was like the death of the dude. I don't know if he had a name. I can't remember now, but he like got his wings ripped off, and like they were all there trying to help him. And they kind of realized that like maybe Feyre doesn't actually hate them and she's just damaged. And then at the same time, she's realized that maybe Tamlin and Lucian aren't horribly evil people. And now she wants to paint. And Tamlin is going to show her the gallery in the next chapter that I'm about to read. Well, at least assumingly, because he said he was going to.
You are at a really good point right now where nobody seems to be evil.
Right.
But just you wait.
There is like a lot of underlying foreshadowing tones, and I know things get very intense. Like I've seen stuff online. I just don't know for actual details. I know a lot of people don't like Tamlin. I don't know why. Obviously, I don't really know him that well yet because I've only seen him a little bit. It's getting interesting. I really like it.
Good, you'll have to keep going.
What about you? How have you been enjoying your book?
I'm currently reading 5 Broken Blades by May Corland. And it is supposed to be based around Korean mythology, which is super interesting. Her little author's note in the beginning kind of explains that it's based on those concepts, but it's not like a retelling of the mythology. She just kind of like took the mythological world and concepts and created this story around that. So I'm really enjoying it. Like every chapter is told from different characters' perspectives. I think we have 4 or 5 different points of view going on. somehow, some way, all of these characters are going to connect because I've noticed they all have the same goal in mind, which is to kill this king.
Interesting.
Yes, so it's very interesting so far. I'm only about 130-ish pages in. So we're still building up the story, but it is getting a lot more intense with the action. This book is definitely not for the faint of heart. The author has a whole list of trigger warnings in the beginning, and it's a lot. It's a very lengthy list. I didn't read all of it because that stuff doesn't bother me, and I don't want to be spoiled by anything. But there are some very gory scenes in this book. Obviously, some of our points of view are told from killers, like killers for hire and whatnot. So all that action is to be expected. But it's really good so far. I've heard really great things, and I'm excited to continue with it. And then I recently finished Heartless Hunter, which is the first book of a duology called The Crimson Moth. And that one was so good. I did not want to put it down at all. And I don't know why I took so long to read it. It's been a super hyped book online for a while now. It's a YA fantasy book. And for some reason, I just never picked it up. I don't really know why. I don't know what I thought was going to be on the inside, but it was not what I was expecting. I actually had no idea that it was about witches. So it takes place in this fantasy world called the New Republic, and it's very simplistic world building. It's not complicated at all. These people are humans. So it's more of a low fantasy novel. There's not many hard concepts to grasp. There's just this like really cool magic that's described because, I mean, obviously some of our characters are witches and they do magic and whatnot. And it goes into a lot of detail with that. And it goes into a lot of detail with the backstory of the New Republic and how it was kind of formed after some sort of like revolution-y thing. It was not complicated, and the coolest part about it is its backstory. So I like that the author kind of made it super simple. I didn't have to think too hard about how it worked.
Yeah, that's nice. Especially with fantasy, I think you can get lost in, the terms and the concepts and stuff like that. So when it's simple, it's sometimes really refreshing.
It was, compared to all the Sarah J. Maas books I've read, it was amazing to have something simple in terms of world building. But Heartless Hunter was told from the perspective of Gideon and Rune. So I guess potential spoiler, close your ears if you haven't read this book yet, but you plan on reading it. Rune is a witch, and witches are now being hunted in the New Republic because of this whole revolution thing and the death of witch queens and whatnot. And people do not like witches. You will get arrested for being a witch. You will be executed for being a witch. If you are a witch sympathizer, you will also be arrested. So Rune is making it her thing to save witches from execution. She's like leading them off this island because the New Republic is an island. And she's trying to lead them off and get them somewhere because she is wealthy. She has a lot of money, so she's able to do that. There's another big thing with Rune, but I'm not going to say it because I don't want to spoil it, because I feel like it is kind of like a big thing of her storyline. And then we have Gideon, who is a witch hunter. And so he is out to get Rune, or so he thinks. And, in the midst of all of it, they kind of like fall in love, even though they shouldn't. Obviously, the romanticy aspect is there, but it was done in such a refreshing way. And it was just so good. Like, both sides were deceitful. You didn't really know who was telling the truth. So there was a lot of air of mystery about that. And I ultimately gave this book 5 stars because it was amazing. I didn't want to put it down. The world building was great. The characters were great. We had some great side characters. The last 100 pages was just like reveal after reveal after reveal. And I was just like, oh my gosh, there's so much happening. But it was so good. Probably one of my top books of the year.
Wow, that's high praise.
It is. And I'm super excited because I actually have the advanced copy of the second book, which is called Rebel Witch. I actually acquired that before I read the first one, which is why I read the first one. And it gave me a reason to read it, which I'm really grateful for because it ended up being really, really good.
And to think this was the book you mentioned that you almost didn't read or you hadn't read for a long time.
Yeah, I hadn't read it and I kind of like just ignored everything about it because I thought I wouldn't like it, but I didn't really know what it was about anyway. I don't know why.
Wow.
I guess like the cover of the book is just like a moth. I mean, it's really pretty. Like, it's a pretty cover, but for some reason, like, that book cover to me made it seem like it was going to be this, like, I don't know, like, not about witches.
Yeah, I could see that. It's funny how it turned out to be one of your favorite books of the year so far.
It is. And I think I just have this, like, weird fascination with witches in books as well. I don't know why. I read another book that featured witches, Wayward by Amelia Hart. I read that a while ago and I loved it. And I think that's when I was like, wow, I need to read more books about witches. Heartless Hunter, amazing. YA fantasy, easy to understand, highly recommend. So, this episode, what was your thought behind this episode?
I was inspired by the r/books subreddit where someone had posted a question saying, what books do you think will become a classic? And while the question was interesting, it was very vague. And like a lot of people in the comments were like, well, what do you mean in the last like 10 years, 15 years, 40 years? Like, because there's certain criteria for a book has to be out for so long for it to become a classic. And then it also has to be, like read enough times and all this kind of thing. And so I thought it would be interesting to pose some questions like that for this episode, and we could talk about them.
Yes, so this episode is pondering some bookish questions. We have a handful of things to discuss, which I'm very excited for. They're questions that I've never really even thought about myself, and some of them were very difficult to come up with answers for.
Well, I'm glad because that was the intention.
Well, sometimes my brain doesn't like to work.
Yeah, I can relate to that.
But before we jump into all those questions, I came across this little thing on Instagram. It's basically this like fantasy trope or fantasy theme meter. And basically, there's 10 categories, and you kind of had to choose how much you enjoyed each fantasy theme. So, for example, fae or fairies, vampires, werewolves, witches, wizards, all that jazz. So we both did this, and I thought it would be interesting to see just how different or similar we are in this regard. I guess the first one is fae or fairies. I really like fae. I like fae in fantasy books.
And so you gave it I guess that's a 5 out of 5.
Yeah.
I would like to say that I did this before I started reading ACOTAR. So my only exposure, I guess you would say, to like fae and fairies of that kind was a book that I read a long time ago. And I just never really got into them. I think it was a Jim Butcher book. I'm not remembering the name though.
Well, I really liked the entire ACOTAR series, and that was really my only exposure to fae, and I loved it. Like this concept of this like being that is like bigger than anybody else. Like they're so strong, they can move so fast, their hearing is like amazing. Like I'd be able to hear something if I were a fae from like 50 yards away.
Yeah, I definitely think the ACOTAR fae are way more interesting than anybody else has portrayed them.
But now any other fantasy book that lists it as having fae, I gravitate towards because I'm like, fae are so cool. Now, what about vampires? Because I'm like iffy on the vampires. I gave this a 3 out of 5.
It's funny, ours is flopped because I gave them 5 out of 5.
I just, I was never a Twilight kid. I never understood the whole vampire thing. My only recent exposure to vampires in books was a paranormal romance by Ali Hazelwood called Bride, and our main character was a vampire. And like, I kind of liked the vampires in that book, but For some reason, they just like never appealed to me. Like to me, there's nothing really cool about them other than they have fangs and they drink blood, I guess.
I mean, that's typically two important factors in a vampire. I've read Abraham Lincoln Vampire Hunter, and there was a modern adaptation of Van Helsing that I read, and then also in the Witcher books, there's some vampires, and every time I run across them in a book, I feel like they're always these just so regal, and they always like exude richness, and they're like above you and they know it and all that kind of thing. And I just always find that very interesting in a character, and it typically brings like another level. In the most recent Witcher book that I read that had a vampire lord, which is like particularly powerful vampire, he was actually the total opposite of that, and that made it even more interesting. I saw like another side that I haven't seen before, and I just always think it's really interesting the way that people portray them, because sometimes they are those like vicious, bloodthirsty kind of vampires, and then other times they're so rich in like magic or science or something along those lines. It just makes for an interesting character.
Now, what about mermaids? I was a mermaid girl growing up. I loved mermaids, but I'm talking like Little Mermaid mermaids, like Ariel
Right.
and stuff, or like that Nickelodeon show H2O.
Which is a great show. I've seen quite a few episodes now.
It is a great show, but those are like what I think of when I think of mermaids, although I do know that there are more sinister mermaids.
I feel like a lot of the times books that are pirate themed or mythology will have mermaids, and those will be like your sort of vicious, evil mermaids, if you will. And those are typically just like seen as a monster. It's usually not much more than that. But I do think that when the mermaids are the center of the story, or there's like a important component with them, it can be really interesting. I also think just mermaids are cool. They're a cool creature, cool idea.
They are cool. I wanted to be a mermaid when I was younger, but unfortunately, that's not realistic.
No, unfortunately.
But now what about elves? Because when I think of elves, I think of Santa's elves.
Well, I do not. I think of, your sort of Tolkien elves, like, Lord of the Rings, and The Witcher has elves, and that's usually, pointy ear, again, regal. They think they're better than you. They're typically very magically in tune, or they're good with like archery and bows.
Well, I gave elves a 2 out of 5 because I've never really read a book that features actual elves. Like, I've never read Lord of the Rings. I've never seen the Lord of the Rings movies.
I think you would actually like the Lord of the Rings movies a lot. They are long, but they're very true to the books. Like, they're a very good adaptation. But my big complaint about this was the fact that you gave fae and fairies a 5 out of 5, but then elves a 2 out of 5, which in my head, they're like very similar. I guess fae and fairies are kind of these like all powerful beings, as where elves are just kind of like a human, but typically a little bit more skilled in many different aspects. But
I've never read anything with elves in them. The only thing I know about elves is stuff that I've seen online, and obviously Santa's elves.
I love the idea that the only elves that you actually know of are Santa's elves. That's very funny.
I know, so I guess my meter for elves is really not that accurate, but
It's a bit skewed.
a little bit. I'm a little biased in that regard. But dragons are cool creatures. I paid into the Fourth Wing craze. I've read Fourth Wing twice, once on the physical, once audio as a refresher. Have not read Iron Flame yet though. However, a lot of books that I've read recently, fantasy-wise, have had dragons. Like When the Moon Hatched, that was really good.
Mm-hmm.
That featured dragons. So I gave dragons a 4 out of 5 because I think they're cool. They're like a versatile creature.
Yeah, I definitely think that depending on how the author wants to write them, they could be wildly different. Like they're really good as both good guys and bad guys in a story. I've read The Witcher has a ton of dragon stuff in it. Dragons for me is more like in video games and movies. There's so many different times that they've portrayed fantastically in there. So that's kind of why it bumped it all the way up to a 5 for me. But in books, I'm never disappointed to hear about a dragon or see a dragon or something.
But werewolves, on the other hand, I'm not a werewolf person. I never really have been. Again, not a lot of experience with werewolves, but in Ellie Hazelwood's Bride, there was a werewolf in there as well. And he was portrayed fine, but he was portrayed as not really having anything like special about him. Like, I didn't think the werewolves were exciting.
I feel the exact opposite.
Oh.
There's a book called Full Moon, which is part of the Dresden series, and that has werewolves in it, and it was incredibly interesting. The way that they were portrayed and talked about, and how some of them were like good and some were bad and some were just kind of like trying to survive and that kind of thing. I don't know why, but I love the idea of there's like one night a year or one night a month where they like turn, and there's the full moon. That's typically the big trope around werewolves. I just think that's interesting. It makes for really good storytelling because it always puts things on like a deadline.
That's true. Maybe I just need to expose myself to more werewolves. But I do love witches. Witches, I had to give a 4.5 out of 5 because I just think they're so cool. Because depending on the story, depending on the author, they can kind of make their witches have a unique magic system.
Yeah, definitely. Well, a lot of the times when you have witches, you have wizards, which is our next category. And especially in the Witcher series, they're amazing. Like the witches and wizards have been such a focal point on a lot of some of the books in there that you read, and it just creates such an interesting world, and it really shows you how many different concepts and things can exist, and how I especially love when they mix like science and magic into one and they kind of make it seamless. I think that is really cool too.
Yeah, and I mean, obviously, I love wizards. I loved Harry Potter growing up.
Right.
I gave wizards a 5 out of 5 because they're just, I mean, again, like they're kind of hand in hand with witches, like you said.
Yeah, where you have wizards, you'll have witches and vice versa.
Yep, and they will do cool magic.
Gotta love it.
And then we have mythology. Obviously, I've been super into the mythology recently. I just think it's so cool how authors can take a real myth and sort of reimagine it in their own way and create like not a whole new story, but a story that, again, like reimagines a certain character or a certain part of this myth into like a different light, which makes it more interesting. Or sometimes authors just take a mythological world and they do whatever with it. They like throw their own characters in there.
Right. And especially whenever they modernize something, I think that's really interesting. Obviously, with the Percy Jackson series, it's like sort of present day, so to speak. I also like when they take different worlds and they sort of blend them together, like a god system or something like that, or a magic system, and kind of bring it to the real world. Kind of almost like what Harry Potter was like. It's not really a mythology, but that concept of like bringing everything to the modern world, I think is really interesting.
I'd have to agree. And then obviously, I love fairy tales. 5 out of 5 for fairy tales. But I'm talking more of like Disney-fied fairy tales, because normal fairy tales, they're like super dark, super twisted.
Yeah.
But if you take the Disney version, yeah, it's the concept of the fairy tale, but it's like sweet and light and
Magical.
yeah, full of magic and happiness.
I gave fairy tales a 3 out of 5, but I think I'm wrong on that, because the more that I think about it, the more I'm like, wait, I actually love fairy tales, but mainly when they're reimagined to something more interesting or like really focusing on a certain aspect of the story.
Yeah, and there are a bunch of authors who still do reimaginings of fairy tales. For example, that one Bridgerton book I read was a reimagining of Cinderella, and I thought it was super obvious in the book. And I liked how the author incorporated that while still bringing the story into the Bridgerton world. Authors are super creative beings, and I like when they take those familiar concepts to readers and they like spin it into something completely new.
Yeah, I completely agree with that.
So, I mean, we weren't like too different with those.
No, we're surprisingly similar now that I look at it again.
I would hope that we are similar. But I guess now it's time to dive into these questions that you put together for us. I'm looking forward to talking about these. Some of them I haven't even thought of ever in my life.
Yes, so I'm excited to talk about these. So, like I mentioned, these were inspired by the posts that I saw on the subreddit for books. And this one is kind of a direct rip of the one, but more specified. So that way it can actually, in my opinion, make a little bit more sense. No offense to that user. But the first question is, what book released in the last 24 years do you think will become a classic?
Well, this question was hard because if I go back and I look at books that were released within the last 24 years, I don't know like half of them because I've not been reading books for my entire life, obviously.
Right. I see what you mean.
So I went back into my recent Goodreads history to see if there were any books that I have personally read that would be deemed a classic in however many years from now. And I think Lessons in Chemistry by Bonnie Garmis has great classic potential because not only was it like one of the most popular books ever, like a couple years ago, it was also fantastic. And it was also Bonnie Garmis's debut, which was even more mind blowing to me. So she combined this theme of feminism into a super intriguing story that wasn't all like preachy on feminism. We have our main character, Elizabeth Zott, and she works at a science lab and she has all this research and whatever, and it is the 1960s, so she is not getting credit where credit is due because that's just not how it worked for women back then. And so I guess long story short, she ends up with a talk show on a TV network teaching people how to cook using chemistry.
That's very interesting.
Oh, it was such a good story. And I don't even want to get into the whole thing because I feel like it's one of those books that's really good when you go in blind, which again makes it great classic potential.
Right.
And I could definitely see it kind of being something that schools would use to kind of like teach the concept of women's rights and whatnot.
I also mentioned in our question here that I didn't read out loud, which is the idea of a classroom classic. This is kind of think your books that you were forced to read by your English teachers. And typically they're shorter stories and they're usually some form of the classic. They're usually like under 250 pages, I think, but not always a requirement. But that being said, I think the one that you mentioned would be a fantastic classic and then also classroom classic. Because yes, it does teach a story, but it seems to do it in a very interesting way.
It did. It was very interesting. It was one of those books that I didn't want to put down. And I feel like there's a lot that people could dissect from it.
Yeah, I think that's a fantastic one. I think my pick for this question, and it's probably bias, would be the Percy Jackson series as a whole, but specifically The Lightning Thief. And my reasoning for that is I feel like it does such a good job of capturing the sort of, I guess, like American experience of just like the young kids traveling across and they talk about across the US and they talk about all the different things that they encounter and all the different concepts and merging mythology into it. I think it's just really interesting. And I think if in another 25 years from now someone were to go back and read that, they would get such like a nice little bite of sort of what life was like, I guess by that time it'd be like 40 years ago. So I think that would be, for me at least, it would be super interesting to read something like that.
Yeah, I mean, reading Percy Jackson honestly would have been better than having to read like these stupid academic mythology books in school because those were
Right.
just so boring.
Yeah, that's how I felt too. Like, I feel like Percy Jackson does such a good job of sort of teaching you the mythology without just drowning you in all this information. It's just very lighthearted.
It's important for reading to be fun.
This next question is a book or book series you wish was longer or had more to the series.
So there was a series that I finished a couple months ago that was on Kindle Unlimited called The Edens by Devney Perry. I've talked about it a lot on this podcast. I just absolutely loved it. That's why. This series features a happily ever after at the end of every book. Again, that's not really a spoiler because when you are reading a romance, I feel like the expectation is that there is a happily ever after. So there is a happily ever after at the end of every book in the Eden series. And I thought it would be interesting to see sort of like a next generation spin-off series of that featuring these people's children.
Oh, I see
Because,
what you're saying.
yeah, so like I think that would be a cool thing to see, like see how they were raised, how they're enjoying being the next generation of Edens living in small town Montana, if they did stay in this small town in Montana. So I think that would be something that's super cool to see. And I feel like it would like give readers who really loved the original series a nostalgic effect almost with reading about more of these characters.
Right. I think that would make for a very interesting concept. It's kind of cool because it's not necessarily like a continuation of the series, but like you said, a next gen. It's like a whole new storyline, which is cool.
Right. It's like the next generation of the Edens family. So you could still get glimpses of your original characters, but them being parents instead of them being, I guess children, but not children. I mean, they were adults in the original series.
Right.
But instead of getting them like dating their current spouse and meeting them and whatever, you would have their kids like going through that same process and seeing how the parents would kind of like react to like all their stuff. Because in the original series, we have their parents as well. The older Edens, we got glimpses of them kind of giving their kids advice. So I think it would be interesting to see it the other way around.
Definitely. The series that I had, or I guess it's actually not a series, it's a book that I would like to become a series, is called Unholy Night by Seth Graham Smith. And it's a retelling of a story from the Bible about the three wise men.
Interesting. So, like, would you want him to do like a whole series of like Bible story retellings?
I think that would be super interesting. Like the Bible stories, or maybe, I don't know if you could really continue from where that book left off just due to the nature of the Bible story, but definitely retellings of those from his point of view, like he did with that one, would be super cool because it was such an interesting book. And if you know the story of the three wise men, you kind of know where it's going, but then he puts all these like little twists and turns but it still fits with the story. So it was super cool to read. I liked it a lot.
Yeah, that's a cool concept. I really like when authors do these standalone series. Like they take one thing and then they kind of like follow that same concept with like a different theme in the next book. Like there's this series by Emily McIntyre. It is the Never After series, I believe it's called. And it's a series of dark romance standalones, but each one is a dark, twisted fairy tale retelling of something. So like there's retelling of Peter Pan, Beauty and the Beast, so on and so on.
Right. Yeah. Like that same concept, except, with these Bible stories, I would think would be super cool.
That would be cool. Maybe I have to read that.
It is not for the faint of heart. I will warn you.
Okay, but when you say it's like a retelling of like a Bible story, is he still like respectful to the actual story? Because I know there's a lot of people out there that would get really upset if he were to like turn a story from the Bible into like something dark and twisty.
I see what you mean. It's still respectful to the relevant like characters, right? Because there is like, baby Jesus in there, and he's very respectful of like Mary and Joseph and Jesus and all that kind of stuff. And the King Solomon, I believe it is, who everybody hates. He's still shown in a light where everybody still hates him. But there is like a lot of gore and a lot of action. And there's a lot of things that I think if you were like, oh, this would be an interesting Bible retelling, and you're looking more for like a light-hearted story, this is probably not the one. But if you're okay with a bit of gore and a bit of action and things like that, I think it's super interesting.
Interesting. Well, that's good to know.
Our next question is probably one of my favorite, which is if you could place a character from one book into another, who would it be and what book would they be placed into?
So there's this character from Throne of Glass, Selena Sardothian. She's a female assassin. And I would plop her into the world of Akotar to see how she fares. Because she is different, per se. She is very much your strong, independent. She don't need nobody to help her with anything because she will sheath knives all over herself. She might get along with Feyre.
Yeah, it sounds like she would.
But I think it would be interesting to see how she would fare in Akotar, even though they are from similar worlds, just at different points in time. I don't think she would have too tough of a time because she would be used to like all these mystical creatures and whatnot.
In concepts and things.
Yeah, she'd be used to that. But just her personality, her like, I don't care personality. Like she's like walking with a swagger all the time. She's like that kind of girl. Because I mean, she is a trained assassin.
Right.
So she has that air about her. And I just think I would like to see how she would get along with the characters from Akotar.
That would be very interesting. And it's also funny that you say that because my character I wanted to put in the Akotar series as well, which is Geralt the Witcher.
Oh my God. Okay, listen, but Selena Sardothian would probably very well get along with Geralt. So if we put both of them into the Akotar world at the same time, they would probably cause mayhem.
That is true. And there's another Witcher that I thought would be really interesting, which is Vesemir. And he is the Witcher that like helped create other ones. And so especially in the Akotar series where it's very clearly that there's a power imbalance between the Fae and the humans, Vesemir like creating Witchers, these incredibly adept monster hunters basically, I think would be really, really interesting.
I just think it would be interesting to take like any non-fantasy character and place them into a fantasy world and see how they fare.
I think that would be super cool. I just keep thinking that taking Geralt and putting him in like so many different stories, I feel like would just solve all your problems.
Well, I think it would just be funny to place Geralt into like a modern world that has technology and stuff.
That would be really funny too. He would not understand all of it.
He wouldn't know what to do. He'd be so confused.
That would be really entertaining. Or putting him in like a romance book because he's very clearly like not good at talking to ladies that are not Yennefer, so it's very funny.
Yeah, but all the ladies would flock to him because he's supposed to be this like super handsome man.
Yes, but in the books, it's actually like talked about that he is kind of terrifying looking. So like in the show, obviously he's portrayed as a very handsome gentleman. But in the books, he's supposed to have like very dark eyes and his hair isn't supposed to be like luscious and just thrown back. It's like mangled and tattered. And he has scars all over his body that are like disgusting looking and not supposed to be like sexy.
Yeah, but some women are into that. They're into like the dark and mysterious.
Yeah, I guess that's true. He also has cat eyes, which I think a lot of people would find terrifying.
Honestly, in real life, yeah.
Right. Like imagine a mangled haired man who's ginormous and muscular with sunken cat eyes looking at you. That is a terrifying image.
I think I would run away.
Yeah. If I was in a fantasy book, though, I'd be like, that guy's probably cool and interesting. This next question is a book or concept that you would like to see rewritten by another author. An example of this question, or example answer, I guess, would be imagine if the Percy Jackson books were written by a romance author, for example, or written by a thriller author.
So This question is particularly difficult because I like books the way they are.
That's fair.
Let's take Percy Jackson. If Percy Jackson was written by, let's pick a romance author. If Percy Jackson was written by someone like Abby Jimenez, who writes romantic comedies, but with depth, the story would probably focus more on Percy finding a love interest in Camp Half-Blood instead of saving the world from mythical creatures.
Right.
And if Percy Jackson was written by, let's say, a Karen Slaughter, obviously it would not be a children's book.
Right.
It would focus a lot more on the gore and the action than anything else.
Yeah, I think those are kind of, that concept is just really cool to me. Just taking a book and it's, imagining what it would be like written by all these different people.
It's interesting to think about, like, if I were to take, like, a cutesy romance book, have it written by a thriller author. I mean, in cutesy romance books, there's, like, zero action, zero thrillery elements. So to have those thrown in, it would be like this, I don't even know what. It would just feel wrong.
I think that's true, but at the same time, I think it could create an interesting storytelling where if maybe the first 100 pages are these cutesy romance and you're going in, you're like, oh, this is just going to be like a fun rom-com. And then all of a sudden the tone shifts and everything changes and now you're into the thriller aspect. I think it could just be very interesting.
It would feel like I've gotten whiplash or something.
I do think it takes a very specific type of book to find that good combo if someone were to actually do it, but I just think it's a cool concept.
Well, what book would you want to see done that way?
I'm not a huge fan of romance. However, I actually think the Witcher series written by a purely sort of romance author would be interesting. I think it would be really, really popular if it was romantasy, because the romance that's in the book is usually a lot more guy focused, if you will. Geralt is just I'm a man, so I'm going to do manly things and I'm going to impress,
Now, what if there was a Witcher told from Yennefer's perspective?
I think that'd be really interesting too. That's a very cool concept.
Because is she super prevalent in the books?
In the most recent one that I read, she was a lot more of the main focus, her and Ciri. But I think a book specifically written from their point of views could be really interesting as well.
It could be. That concept has always fascinated me. If we got a story told from a different character's perspective, how different would it be?
Especially if it's written in the first person, like Akotar is written in Feyre's point of view, but maybe one from Lucien's point of view could be really interesting. I mean, I don't know if he's there permanently, but so far he's there in the book or as far as I've gotten in the book. So this next question actually tied into the previous one is rewriting a book in another genre.
You see, that's hard for me to answer as well, because let's say we do take Akotar and we take all the fantasy out of it and it just turns into romance. It would not be set in this fantastical world. It would be set in your normal human world. And
That's true.
Our Fae would not be Fae. They would just be humans. Everyone's a human if there's no fantasy.
Right.
And honestly, Akotar would be super dull and boring if it wasn't fantasy.
That's probably true. Yeah, I could see that. But maybe instead of Akotar being romance and fantasy, it was thriller fantasy.
Does thriller fantasy even exist? Because that is something that if it does, I have not found it and I have not read it.
That's true. I don't know if I've ever heard of it even being a thing, but
it would just be fantasy with some scary things, which honestly, that's all fantasy.
Well, that's true.
But if you were to take the romance out of Akotar and it was just fantasy, let's say it's not romantasy, I wonder what Feyre's fate would even be like. Because obviously she wouldn't be falling for Tamlin because it's not a romance book.
Right. I think or if she did still, it would be much more focused on like her escaping and her maybe still trying to take them down or just do damage. Like it probably would be much more focused on the action as well instead of it always kind of coming back to this like tension between the characters.
It would, and once again, it would be dull and boring.
Well, maybe. That one I think well, I guess the whole point of ACOTAR is the romance. So maybe you are onto something with books are designed the way they are.
Well, it's just hard for me to imagine like any book becoming a different genre than it is.
Well, so like my answer for this is the idea of the Harry Potter books instead of being YA fantasy, whatever you want to call that. I thought it'd be super interesting if it was instead like thriller fantasy. So now you're when they talk about the suspense of like, you know, the all the happenings that happen, like the ogre showing up and the snakes and all that kind of stuff, but if it's from a more thrillery undertone, I think it would make the book like way more intense. Obviously, you'd probably have to lose the YA part of it and it would be maybe just like a full-blown adult book, but I think it could be really interesting. Age up the characters probably as well.
I mean, Harry Potter, it's already actiony. It's already adventure-y.
Right. Which is why you got to have the scary aspect with the thriller.
I mean, to a child, it's probably scary already.
It's I could see it being like a little creepy, yeah. The next one is who is an author you would like to meet?
I would like to meet all of the authors.
Every single one.
Every single one in the world. It's a lot of authors. No, but if I were to narrow it down, I'd want to meet my favorite ones. So obviously, it would be cool to meet Sarah J. Maas. It would be cool to meet Karen Slaughter, Allie Hazelwood, Abby Jimenez, Catherine Center, like all of those people, all of like I've read a lot of their books. Like it would be interesting to meet Kristen Hanna. Like I'd love to hear her talk about how she comes up with all of her ideas because I think she's probably one of the best historical fiction writers out there right now. And it'd just be cool to like pick some of these people's brains and be like, how do you come up with these stories?
Yeah, I think it would be really interesting specifically to talk to Sarah J. Maas and Rick Riordan because I feel like both of them were victims, so to speak, of the boom of like, you know, they released their first couple of books and then all of a sudden everybody loves them and they explode and they're just off the shelves all the time. Like I would be very interested to know what their thoughts were on when that was happening.
That would be really cool to know because I can't imagine being a best-selling author and having people just rave about my books all the time and just keep buying them years after they've been released.
Right.
I think it would be something that I never thought would happen. Because, I mean, you write this story, you obviously have to get an agent, send it to publishers, get it published. I mean, fingers crossed, somebody wants to publish your book.
Right.
And then it does. And then, I mean, obviously, the publisher, it's on them too to like market it so well, make amazing cover art, write the best blurbs, just like get it out in front of people. So like it's on them too. So honestly, they probably had amazing teams at their publishing houses
Right.
that got it all out there to the point where now, years and years and years later, people still want to read their books for the first time.
Right. Like that whole concept is crazy to me. Still, after all this time, people go back and read Percy Jackson, or there's so many people that even now are getting reinterested in ACOTAR like I did and my friend Alex. And I've heard, you know, it bleeding over to sort of the guy side of Instagram that I see. And it's just very interesting that it's blown up and it felt like to me so quickly.
It is called the age of social media. So people are talking about these books again, but online on platforms where everybody sees it.
Right.
And they're just making the rounds. They're like trending now. And it's all due to social media.
Right. Such an interesting path to be on and experience. I would love to hear what they thought about it when going through all of that.
It would be interesting.
All right. And our last question is, who is a character from a book that you would like to meet and or be friends with?
I would obviously love to be friends with Rune from Heartless Hunter, the book that I was just raving about. She just seems so awesome, so smart. Obviously, she's a witch. I want to ask her about being a witch. I want to know more about her story of when she found out she was a witch. Even though it was described in the book, I would just want to know it from her firsthand and just like get her experience of the New Republic and everything. And she just also seems so fun to be with. Like she's wealthy, so like she's in all the social circles, and I would love to like ask her about that. But also her personality just seems so fun. And then obviously we have Lysandra from Throne of Glass. Lysandra is a shapeshifter, and I think it would be really cool to be friends with a shapeshifter. I mean, she just seems really fun anyway. And then Iris from Divine Rivals. I would love to be friends with her as well. She's just so cunning and smart, and she's a journalist. And I mean, not to spoil anything from the books, but like being on the front lines in a war seems like something I would want to ask her about. Like, how was that experience? Because it had to be terrifying. And again, she just seems super awesome, super sweet. Obviously, I would want to meet Roman Kit through her, who is her love interest, because they're just perfect together.
Well, I mean, a shapeshifter would be really cool to meet. I think that was probably my pick out of the ones you mentioned. It would be cool to meet like really any character that had magical powers of some kind, and just like getting a better understanding of how they work would be super cool. One of the ones that I think would be cool to meet is Roran from Curses and Cocktails. This was a romantasy book that I read by S.L. Roland, and he has blood magic that's like completely in tuned to his body. And I just thought the whole concept that was written in the book of that blood magic was super cool. And I would love to be friends with him because, first of all, he also ran, a nice little business of selling cocktails, and he got really good at making them. So I could learn a bunch of those from him. But also, hearing about that magic and talking about his abilities would be super cool as well.
It would be really cool. I mean, obviously, I would love to meet any of the characters from Agotar, any of the characters from Throne of Glass, like any of the characters from any of my favorite books.
Yeah, same. My other big pick would be Logan from the first Law trilogy. He's just this like ginormous barbarian, hardworking type of guy. And he just seems so like down to earth. I feel like I could hang out with him and it would not be weird. It would be like a normal friend. He also has like some magical capabilities and things. So it'd be interesting to learn about those kind of things too. He does go into like a crazy rage though, and basically try to kill everybody. So I guess you got to be careful of that. But as long as he doesn't do that, we're okay.
Yeah, don't provoke him, I guess.
Right. That is all of our questions for today, but those were very interesting answers, and I'm glad I got to pick your brain and learn a little bit about your thoughts and feelings on these things.
Yeah, it was super interesting to, actually have to think about them.
Right, like, use your brain and try to mesh characters and mesh ideas and all that kind of stuff.
So to kind of get away from the bookish speak for a second, what are you currently obsessed with?
I would say I am currently obsessed with the electrolyte flavor packets that I got from Walgreens. They're strawberry flavored and they are delicious. They remind me of, this is a very specific thing, but the Rockstar energy drinks had a whipped strawberry, which I think they do again, but it's really, really hard to find. But that flavor of energy drink was my favorite thing in the world. Energy drinks are obviously not very good for you, so I didn't drink it all that often, but finding it in an electrolyte package that's relatively good for you, I would say, is really awesome. So I'm obsessed with that.
I am obsessed with Finding Nemo. Again, I mean, I guess I always am because it is my favorite movie. But watching the movies again recently just makes me wish I could talk to them,
Talk to fish.
talk to fish, but more specifically be in the world of Finding Nemo.
It is a very like fun world.
It is. It is a fun world. And I just watched Finding Dory too. And again, I don't know what it is about these Pixar writers, but they like know how to make like a really sad story.
Yeah, that's true. They're good at, building it up and sort of making you really feel and relate to the characters.
That they do, but I mean, Finding Nemo has been my favorite movie for ever and ever and ever. It was the first movie I ever saw in a movie theater, and I guess that's just why I love it. And now it makes me want to go back to Disney World and go to the seas with Nemo and friends and just be immersed in it through their little aquarium.
Yeah, that's true. We'll have to go there when we go there.
Yes, we will. We obviously will because the aquarium is a must-do stop for me.
Absolutely.
They have manatees. I gotta watch those manatees eat their hunks of lettuce.
Oh, yeah, the giant lettuce that they toss at them.
Yeah, those are fun. That's why the U.S. was having a romaine shortage.
Feeding it all to the manatees.
Yeah, they're going all to the manatees at Disney World.
That's amazing.
But I love the submarine Nemo ride in Disneyland. I wish they had that at Disney World.
Oh, yeah, I remember that one.
I loved it. You look out the little porthole and it's like 10 minutes and you just like see all these fun, cute little Nemo creatures in the water. And you're like in a real submarine. I mean, not a real submarine, but like you're actually underwater.
Right, yeah, you're like submerged. Not fully, the top always stays up, but it makes it feel like you're completely submerged.
Yeah, it's cool. It's fun. I just love Finding Nemo. But what are you reading this week?
I am continuing Sea of Monsters and continuing ACOTAR. And I will have Sea of Monsters finished next time we talk. And I'm hoping to make a lot more progress on ACOTAR as well.
I am hoping you make a lot more progress on ACOTAR too. I'm working my way through 5 Broken Blades still. I hope to have that finished shortly. And then, well, I guess I did have another library hold come in. It was my last one, Not in Love by Allie Hazelwood. So I guess I'll be reading that if it's still available for me to pick up because it came into the library a couple days ago. So I'll have to see if they canceled it because I've been really lazy about not getting there. So that'll probably be another book that I'm going to start this week. But then I want to get serious about reading my actual shelves.
You gotta. There's so many waiting for you.
There are so many waiting for me. And I just need to stop going to the library for a second and read these books. But I'm just about ready to go immerse myself back into this world of 5 Broken Blades. And you're probably ready to go immerse yourself into some fairies.
Yes, absolutely.
I hope everyone has a wonderful week. Go read a great book. Enjoy some time outdoors, maybe. It's going to be hot, but should be sunny. And happy reading.